Welcome everyone to session 2 in our 3-part webinar series entitled Taking Shape, New Perspectives on Arab Abstraction, which is co-organized by New York University's Gray Art Gallery and Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies and co-sponsored by Arte East. My name is Lucy Oakley and I'm Head of Education and Programs at the Gray. This webinar series is being offered in conjunction with the Gray's exhibition Taking Shape, Abstraction in the Arab World, 1950s to 1980s, which was on view when the gallery shut down in March due to COVID-19. Tonight's webinar session will focus on Arab abstraction and Arabic letterforms. Could we have the next slide? But before we begin tonight's session, I'll say a few words about the incredibly turbulent time we're living in now. Even as many parts of the US are still in lockdown due to the COVID-19 crisis, we're confronted with the shocking deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, Tony McDade in Tallahassee, and Deion Johnson in Phoenix. Their deaths at the hands of police and the deaths of so many others throw a harsh spotlight on the systemic racism in our country and the gross inequities of the American justice system. At the Gray, as we grapple with how to best understand and take action, we're revisiting images by Ernest, the Black South African photographer whose work you see on the screen. His work documents the evils of apartheid, and we exhibit it in 2014. On the screen is a photograph from Cole's 1967 photo book, House of Bondage, where it appeared with the caption, "Handcuffed Blacks were arrested for being in white area illegally." In the text, Cole states, "When I say that people can be fired or arrested or abused or whipped or banished for trifles, I am not describing the exceptional case for the sake of being inflammatory. The essential cruelty of the situation is not that all Blacks are virtuous and all whites are villainous, but that the whites are conditioned not to see anything wrong in the injustices they impose on their Black neighbors." The Gray Art Gallery stands with Black Lives Matter in solidarity, anger, and sadness. As a university art museum, we are dedicated to promoting visual literacy, and we implore you to look, read, and learn to grasp the history of police brutality and racial violence in the US, and to denounce its continued sanctioning. Museums are not neutral. We are obliged to do much more to foster inclusivity and accessibility, and to provide space for many voices in our exhibitions and public programs, including the program you're about to hear tonight. The Gray's current Taking Shape exhibition and this webinar series highlight, in part, the important roles played by artists in North Africa and West Asia in the post-World War II era, as newly liberated countries threw off the colonial yoke and its systemic racism. And as you'll learn tonight, abstract art served as a keystone in forging these new national identities. At this point, I'd like to express heartfelt thanks to the people whose support and encouragement has been essential to organizing this webinar series: Jim Ryan of NYU's Kevorkian Center and Beth Stryker of Arte East, for their kind collaboration and co-sponsorship, and to my Gray colleague, Eric Orisic, who is overseeing technology behind the scenes. Tonight's program will last for about an hour and 15 minutes or so. At the end, Pepe Carmel, our moderator, will pose audience questions to the speakers. You can submit a question anytime by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We've turned off the chat feature, but feel free to send comments through the Q&A also. The entire webinar series is being recorded, and each session will be posted on the Gray's website with closed captions in the future. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Pepe Carmel. He has been my treasured colleague for over 20 years at NYU, where he's currently Associate Professor of Art History. His new book, Abstract Art, A Global History, will be published by Thames and Hudson in 2020. Pepe has curated several exhibitions at the Gray, including Robert Morris Felt Works in 1989 and New York Cool in 2008. He has often co-organized public programs with me, including his talk last February on post-colonial abstraction in the Middle East. Other exhibitions he's curated include Jackson Pollock at MoMA in 1998, The Age of Picasso at Fundación Botín in 2004, and Conceptual Abstraction at Hunter College Gallery in 2012. Other publications he has written for include Art in America and the New York Times. His book, Picasso and the Invention of Cubism, was published by Yale University Press in 2003. And now I will pass the mic to Pepe.
Thank you, Lucy. I want to begin by seconding your sentiments and the importance of the gallery and NYU in supporting Black Lives Matter, and hoping that we can continue to make a difference, to change public opinion, to change government behavior in a productive way. And if this panel tonight has some effect in opening up people's minds to dealing productively with difference, then we will have done something useful. So to come to our specific topic, I want to really just briefly introduce the two speakers and then let them tell you what they have to say for themselves. So the first speaker will be Iftikhar Dadi, who is Associate Professor in Cornell's Department of Art History and Visual Studies. I want to note that he's also an artist. He works collaboratively with his wife, Elizabeth Dadi, and their efflorescence series was recently shown at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, England. But coming back to his career as an art historian, he is the author of Modernism and the Art of Muslim South Asia, published in 2010, which traces the emergence of artistic subjectivity in Pakistan since independence, as framed by the concepts of nationalism, modernism, cosmopolitanism, and tradition. The book situates modernism as something that is transnational, not stuck within a particular national art history. And this is truly essential reading. It's a book I keep going back to. He's also edited or co-edited a series of important catalogs, including Tarjama, Translation, Contemporary Art from the Middle East, Central Asia, and Their Diasporas, which was at the Queen's Museum in 2009. Lines of Control, Partition as a Productive Space at the Johnson Museum at Cornell in 2012. And most recently, Anwar Jalal Shemsa, the important British artist at London in 2015. He's currently completing a new book called The Long 60s Cinema in Lahore. Our second speaker will be Nada Shabout, who is professor of art history at the University of North Texas. And she is the author of Modern Arab Art, Formation of Arab Aesthetics, published in 2007, which is another truly foundational work in this field. If you want to know about art in the Middle East, this is something you absolutely need to read. She has been co-editor of New Vision, Arab Art in the 21st Century, published in London in 2009, which is a fantastically useful survey. Again, a book I keep going back to. And more recently, one of the three editors for Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents, published by the Museum of Modern Art in 2018, which I have not read yet, but it is my summer reading. Okay, she also has a special interest in art from Iraq, which has a especially rich art world. She's been the editor and the author for Dafatir, Contemporary Iraqi Book Art in 2007, the co-curator and author for Modernism and Iraq, which was at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia in 2009. And she also has a book forthcoming called Demarcating Modernism in Iraqi Art, The Dialectics of the Decorative, 1951 to 1979, which I think is going to be a real revelation for a lot of us and a terrific addition to the literature. Since 2009, she's been an important advisor to Mataf, the Arab Museum of Modern Art in Doha. She is also the founding president of the Association for Modern and Contemporary Art from the Arab world, Iran, and Turkey, which has a great website, amcainternational.org, which is really worth going to take a look at. All right, with that said, let me hand the microphone over to Iftikhar, so to speak.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Lucy and Pepe, for also contextualizing our moment, the moment we are in. Thanks for everyone for being here. So I wanted to basically talk about two artists who are in the exhibition and give some background to their work, but also sketch a general background of abstraction in the Arab world, which is to say that in the Arab world, it makes for a especially important study for the internal plurality of abstraction, because the region is so diverse. It's an enormous geographic area. It's been home to people of various backgrounds. Not all of them are Arab, right? Which it includes a large number of Amazigh and Sub-Saharan people in the Maghreb and in the Sudan, Greeks, Armenians, and Kurds in Egypt and the Levant, and historic and contemporary exchanges between Iran, South Asia, and Gulf region, for example. It includes communities who adhere to various beliefs and who speak multiple languages, including English and French. And if a precondition for modernism is an uneven social and cultural formation, the starkly irregular processes of modernity across the region during the 20th century have been especially productive for artists. So abstraction in the Arab world can't be subsumed under a single formal or stylistic marker, I would argue. Rather, there are multiple trajectories that flourish individually and in groups. We can look at works formally, biographically, and contextually, but also one of the things I think that is important to emphasize is that the work also has to speak across space and time. In other words, it also has to literally abstract itself from the conditions of its making and make claims, for reception on us, whether those claims are formal and sensory or whether they are social or of some kind in nature that transcend the specific instances of its making. So abstract art in the Arab world, bears these multiple potentialities. Its capacity for phenomenological and sensorial affect, its openness to exploration and play, its probing of subjectivity, its quest for spiritual, formal, and social utopianism, and its project of forging an aesthetic that transcends self and other, Arab and non-Arab. Abstraction by artists were thus creative and experimental gambits. They emerged in dialogues with the existing social world, but also offered openings towards more capacious subjectivities and universes. So the specific sort of trajectory I'll be examining here is what I call calligraphic abstraction. This is a phenomena which is a part of post-war decolonization, which engendered this in not just the Arab world, but also in places like South Asia and Iran. A profound search for new artistic languages began at that time, which would seek to recover expressivity that had been repressed under colonialism, but that would also actively produce a new modern culture. From the mid-50s, artists contributed to a movement that transformed aspects of Arabic calligraphy into modern art, often without direct knowledge of one another's work. The abstract and expressive possibilities of the Arabic script were now imbued with figuration and abstraction so that they resist a straightforward literal or narrative meaning. From the mid-20th century on, the non-Western artists in the aftermath of Picasso's Cubism, Wilfredo Lam's surrealist synthesis of Cubism with Africana motifs in Cuba, and other mid-century movements like letterism, art brut, and art informal were far more compelling modalities than other realist European academic styles. Growing awareness of national independence and sovereignty created a demand for a new aesthetic of decolonization, one that would remain in dialogue with metropolitan developments, but would also account for regional and nationalist specificities. Clearly, the stakes were very high as artists were expected to develop a new cultural language that would exploit the opening provided by decolonization, understood at the time as an opportunity to enact a truly world historical shift in politics and culture. So can we move to the next slide, please? The two artists I'll focus on are, we don't have so much time, but one is Muhammad Khadda from Algeria, and the second is Ibrahim Al-Salahi from the Sudan, but he lived for extended periods in Qatar and the UK as well. And you notice that both of them are born in 1930. So that gives you a sense of a kind of a generational experience. Muhammad Khadda grew up in Algeria from a childhood experience marked by extreme poverty. He was tenacious and intelligent and taught himself art and exposed himself to wider cultural and intellectual currents, becoming an accomplished artist and a leading promoter and organizer of modern art. As a young man, he was also a participant witness to great political and social upheaval as Algeria finally attained freedom from French rule after a protracted and bloody struggle. Can we move to the next slide? The political transition influencing the founding of, in 1967, of a art movement known as Auchem or Amazigh for tattoo, and the School of Sign of which Khadda was an active participant. Despite witnessing a tremendous social upheaval firsthand, Khadda's embrace of abstraction in his mature career suggests that abstraction offered him a language more capacious in addressing his life and the times he inhabited than versions of realisms or the art of protest. In an important manifesto from 1964, he notes, so can we look at the next image? And this is an image that I'll focus on and discuss in some detail, but let's move to the next slide now. In this manifesto from 1964, he notes, high art in opposition to the art of agitation is what in the long term transforms social custom as it transforms itself. Against the claim that the people are the only judge, in other words, art should be transparently accessible to the masses, he says, according to this assumption, the work of art is judged by its level of accessibility to the public. This is a seductive idea and seems revolutionary, but it is demagogic and will only slow down the evolution of its people. And also he notes that the people are not a single entity, but have multiple tastes and needs. So let's go back one slide. So chromatic intensity characterizes many of Khadda's abstract works. In this work, green abstraction on orange background from 1969, the surface is worked over to create texture that accentuates the glowing intensity of the orange color field, on which a calligraphic sign hovers at a diagonal angle. The lower quarter of the canvas creates a break in the orange field with a row of masked white forms that bear resemblance to distant architectural motifs, but might equally evoke a sign or a calligraphic motif rendered in geometry. By amalgamating these graphemes characters towards abstraction, Khadda's reference is more abstract than legible citation of the Arabic script. It simultaneously evokes it, but also Amazigh patterns that are inscribed on the body. And they're also analogous to the manner in which architectural forms are silhouetted against the stark Algerian landscape. So now can we move 2 slides? Yeah, here. Okay. Now let me discuss this work by Ibrahim Al-Salahi, The Last Sound, which is a square canvas with a, no, please, let's go back. Yeah, this one. Let's stay on this one for a bit. Palette of grays and earth tones, and it's organized around this circular dynamic core in which you have these radiant lines thrusting outward. And you also have barely perceptible African mask-like forms, celestial bodies, elements of calligraphic, geometric, and animate shapes, and actual Arabic calligraphy in a palimpsest-like writing is surround the central form, creating a universe in which the last sound is echoed. The title refers to the Islamic practice of reciting prayers for the dead and the dying. In the work, Al-Salahi renders the soul's passage from the corporeal to the celestial as it traverses towards heavenly forms inhabiting the universe and beyond. The Last Sound is a manifestly modernist work in which the terrifying event of death is metaphorized in a dynamic formal composition. Here, the abstraction of African sculptural forms in calligraphy serves to universalize the event. So the relation that Salahi creates between African abstract forms and calligraphy was part of his long-standing research that he started to do once he graduated from the Slade. So he was, this comes from a period of intense experimentation between 1958 and the late 60s. Al-Salahi was born in Sudan, in Khartoum, and then went to the Slade for training in 1954 through 1957. And let's look at some more of his works. Can we advance the slides? Yes, this funeral as and a crescent on the death of Patrice Lumumba, 1963. Next one. A print, the River Nile, which you can see undulating in the print. And the next one. The embryo, the child, and the bird from this series from this period of experimentation, they always appear. Okay, let's go to the next slide. By the late 50s and the early 60s, the failure of painting to break out of its narrow salon circuit in Khartoum and made Salahi move towards a more radical shift. This transformation demanded breaking open the Arabic letter and exploring the new aesthetic universe that emerged from the fragments. So let's see the next slide. Okay, and he's very reflective about his process, and which I'm giving you some statements. So he says, I worked like mad, introduced Arabic writing and decorative patterns in a corner of my works like a stamp on an envelope. People recognizing something they were familiar with took note and came a bit closer. I gradually spread the lettering with symbols, words from the Quran and Sufi poetry over the surface of the picture, mixing it with figurative work. They came closer, showing a degree of interest. Next. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Okay. In the next step, I wrote letters and words that did not mean a thing. I had to break down the bone of the letter. This is his wording, right? I had to break down the bone of the letter, observing the space within a letter and between letters. The Pandora's box opened up wide before my eyes. I discovered animal and plant forms, sounds, human image of what looked like skeleton with mask faces. Or in other words, one way to think about this is that it also opened up West African iconography for him. Al-Salahi's intellectual formation became even broader during his travels in the United States. In the mid-60s, where he had a chance to meet with artists, jazz musicians, political activists, and Black intellectuals. As the example of negritude, the Francophone Black cultural movement that emerged in the 30s shows, in an important sense, the experience of diaspora engendered transnational aesthetic movements, as well as new affiliations of identity and community. Al-Salahi also facilitated the imagining of a broader African aesthetic, not least by his participation in exhibitions in Nigeria in 1961 and in Senegal in 1966. while his contribution is distinctive in developing an aesthetic of decolonization for Sudan and much of Africa, situated among the remnants of Islamic textuality, African plastic forms, and transnational modernism, it can be usefully compared to other artists who were engaged with similar cultural problems in the wake of decolonization from the mid-20th century onwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Iftikhar, and thank you, Lucy and Pepe, for your introduction and for your words about the situation as well. 15 minutes sounds so much even less than having just heard Iftikhar speak than it would, I would have imagined. So I'm going to try to not necessarily repeat what Iftikhar had, sorry, why is this not working the way I want to? Iftikhar had introduced in terms of abstraction in the Arab world. And I would just build on his arguments about the shift, particularly in the post-war and during the sort of post-colonial struggles and change in the shift that artists had to kind of undergo in terms of understanding their own identity as well. So I'm going to look at text, Arabic text, as a specific type of line mediation that invokes a specific form of abstraction. The catalog of the exhibition has various examples and arguments about what abstraction meant in the Arab world. But I'm going to look at this one specific incident where Arab artists found in both traditional calligraphy and Harufiyya a space for experimenting with abstraction. Thus, it may have been, one can argue that the interest in abstraction is what fueled the prominence of Arabic letters in the art of the second half of the 20th century. While there are several arguments about abstraction in the Arab world by today by various scholars, it is actually important to know that Arab artists themselves were very much engaged in discussion about what abstraction is and what it meant for them during that period. So to sort of just sum up some of the arguments, abstraction in general was seen as either an index of progress or a sign of succumbing to European influence. Does it, in other words, the argument was, does it represent us, the people at that moment of time? To many Arab artists, however, abstraction signaled quality. And so in the various positions, within these various positions, we can argue that the Arabic letter opened up new avenues for Arab artists, and for a while resolved the tension that surrounded abstraction and its earlier perception of its the earliest perception of it as necessarily opposed to national identity. Indeed, in the 1960s, the Arabic letter became well-rooted as a cultural signifier, and following the 1967 Naksa, the defeat of the Arab armies by Israel, and the 6 Days War, a stronger marker of identity. Now, within this context, I want to specifically look at 4 Iraqi artists with 4 Iraqi experiments that are sort of, different generations, and including generations that preceded the ones that Iftikhar just looked at. So within this Iraqi modern context, I am arguing that it is part of the notion of istilham, a very complicated term that is a performative process-oriented concept that, comes from the Arabic root laham, which is to inspire, but, as I said, is way more complex as a concept that looked at the letter as part of the heritage and a way of moving forward. Now, those 4 Arab artists, before I even talk about these 4 Arab artists, I want to put on the table the notion that represents the impact of education, specifically at that moment of history in Iraq, which is coming through the impact of the Syrian Iraqi educator, Sata al-Husri, who was appointed the General Director of Education in Iraq in 1921. He is a pivotal figure in constructing a national consciousness during Iraq's transformation from an Ottoman province to a modern state based on Arabism. Al-Husri later became Director General of Antiquity and had a tremendous influence on artists, particularly as they were sent on scholarships, but as they return and work at museums as well. First artist I want to look at is Madiha Omar, and I'm using the image that has become sort of the promotion for the whole series of talks. Madiha Omar, born in Syria, was educated in Istanbul for a while before moving to Iraq, Baghdad, where she actually became the first woman artist who was sent on a government scholarship to the UK, to London, to study education. So she was trained as a teacher, but who also focused specifically and excelled in art and craft during her studies in London. When she returned to Baghdad, she taught at the Academy, the Academy of Fine Arts in Baghdad, and became a department chair at one point before she then married an Iraqi diplomat in 1939 and moved to DC in 1942, where her husband was stationed, where she also was able to finally study art as, art on its own at the Corcoran School of Art, and graduated in 1952 with a BA and an MFA in 1959. Now, it's during her time in the US that she actually stumbles and discovers calligraphy in a book on calligraphy by Abbott, and then sees in the calligraphy what has become an interest for her through the rest of her career. She located her interest in the graphic and abstract possibilities of the Arabic letter in that discovery of calligraphy. For Omar, calligraphy, rooted in Islamic heritage and the pride of the region, was an artistic development that valued the Arabic letter for its sacred connections to the Quran. Liberating the letter from calligraphic rules detached it from the sacredness and allowed it to be seen for its plastic qualities. To Madiha Omar, to Omar, the letter was always was seen always for the potential of its plastic qualities. She would actually develop a whole series of work that were exhibited at the library in DC that were focused on the Arabic letter, and she published a booklet with it called Arabic Calligraphy, an Inspiring Element in Abstract Art. In this one extract that I want to highlight, is she says, I started using the Arabic alphabet as a basis of my abstract painting, gradually developing it from plain surface manipulation into the more expressive dynamic movement of a thought in a picture using the letters appropriate to the meaning of that abstraction, considering their force, individuality, rhythmic effect, power of expression, and adaptability. She also was aware of sort of, the various previous studies where the Arabic letter can be seen as, different characteristic, different personalities. And she took that into the sort of, next stage of endowing the letter with, expressive and individual personalities. So we can see in her work that she is in fact looking at the letter as part of a larger sort of decorative pattern. And I mean by decorative here, not an ornamental necessarily, but rather a pattern and a surface manipulation that she would take sort of where she sees calligraphy as akin to arabesque, for example, and sees the letter where here, for example, you see the letter Aleph the first letter in the alphabet as a sort of an individual person in its repetition here, again, the reference to the pattern, or in the other work where it is sort of part of this expressive surrealist imagination that she is developing. The second artist I want to talk about, which is sort of contemporary to Omar, is Jamil Hammoudi. Jamil Hammoudi is initially a self-taught sculptor who nevertheless was sort of part of the intellectual circle, was in fact teaching art in schools in Baghdad when in 1944, when he decided that he wanted to attend the art classes at the academy in Baghdad and graduated in 1945. In 1947, he received a scholarship to study at the Beaux-Arts in Paris. As we can see in his early work, while he's still in Baghdad, sort of, you know, he has surrealist sort of interests and tendencies, but the Arabic letter is part of the woven pattern of the work itself, that while he's in Paris, where he is actually also able to see the heritage at the Louvre Museum. But as he experiences sort of a personal spiritual crisis, he finds within Sufism a way out, but also in the Arabic letter, a form of self-expression and identity preservation that kind of helped him not only as a personal sort of resolution, but also to change his art completely. Now, unlike Omar, Hammoudi would engage with sort of a full text, whether parts, verses from the Quran or other proverbs, and sort of formulate this more of a, what I'm going to call a Kufic Kubo style, where while you may not necessarily be able to read the letters, specifically the words, but you kind of can, it is akin to the epigraphy in decorating mosques, where it invokes that spirituality when you look at it. Both Madiha Omar and Jamil Hammoudi are attributed with the start of this sort of notion of hurufiyya, the use of the Arabic letter, which I would say kind of also are instigated this notion of istilham, which we see more in the work of Shakir Hassan al-Said, who was a theorist, educator and a painter himself as well, who was more influential, and particularly as part of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art that he co-founded with Jawad Salim in 1951. Now, Shakir Hassan actually trained at the trained as a teacher at the college in Baghdad and in the social sciences, and then went to the Art Academy in Baghdad as well, where he did meet Jawad Salim, who was his teacher. But while he was a student, he actually helped him sort of theorize the part of co-founding the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, who a group that focused on the notion of istilham, using tradition, turath, as part of moving forward with art. Now, Shakir Hassan would then receive a scholarship, will go to Paris, where he studied at the Beaux-Arts. He graduates in 1959, returns to Iraq. But while he's in Paris, he too experienced more of an existential crisis and finds his way out of it through Sufism. That has a profound sort of effect on how his art develops after that. Shakir Hassan is a very important artist because he is able to influence many students, many artists after, as an educator at the college or at the academy. And as part of this notion of istilham, he invokes istilham al-harf, the letter, and in 1971 forms a group that he calls the al-bu'd al-wahid, the one dimension, of which Madiha Omar and Jamil Hammoudi took part and in fact, the text that I just sort of read for you was part of a booklet, a questionnaire that they responded to that was published in occasion of their second exhibition in 1973. Now, moving forward, because I am running out of time, to my fourth experiment, which is Thea Zawi, with a different generation again, who comes after Shakir Hassan al-Said, and Thea Zawi from the beginning. The letter had more of a revolutionary sort of position for him, and would become even more so. And Thea Zawi is someone who was fully trained in Iraq. He studied archaeology before joining the Art Institute and graduating from the Art Institute. He worked at the Iraqi Museum, so heritage to him was more direct, but also following the 1967 Naksa and his sort of idea of art and politics takes on even a stronger sort of position. And in his work, we see the letter from the beginning as part of the sort of composition. It is never about the letter. It's not about it being legible, despite the fact that he had a strong sort of connection with poetry. Now, Azawi would take those experiments with the letter to sort of the next level, where he, helped form this notion of dafater, which is a sort of more of a vessel. Dafater is the Arabic word for notebook, where these artist books will have a whole new sort of formulation of letter and text and image in the work that they develop. So, I mean, again, to wrap up, to just sort of look at the Arabic letter here as part of a wider abstraction movement, but also a wider notion of istilham. And with that, I'm going to end my talk. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you, both of you, Iftikhar, Nada, for these fascinating, jam-packed talks. And I only wish we had, more time for both of you. Let me start. I'm going to ask, so our audience understands the process here. I'm going to start by posing just a few questions for our two speakers. And then we'll not literally throw the floor open, but we have a number of questions that have come in the Q&A box, and I will read or summarize those questions, shifting to the audience questions rather than my own. But to start with my own, obviously the history of Arabic calligraphy is incredibly rich and diverse. And if you go back and look over the evolution from Kufic script in the 7th century, square Kufic in the 13th century, Toulouse in the 9th century, Nashq in the 12th century, Nastaliq Diwani in the Ottoman Empire, and so forth, there are very distinct formal characteristics for each of these. And I'm wondering, this is a question for both of you, Nada and Iftikhar, to what extent do the artists you showed us respond to particular historical scripts, as opposed to a general idea of calligraphy?
So
go ahead.
No, so thanks, Pepe. That's a good question. So one thing I want to say is that the Arabic script was actually used by many languages, right? So was used for Persian, it was used for Urdu, it was used for Javi, it was used for Ottoman, it was used for Central Asian languages and so on, right? So it's actually something, if you think of the Arabic script, it should really be thought of like the Latin script, which is not the property of anyone. It's not just the property of English, for example. It's used by many languages, right? Okay. The second thing that happens is the print revolution, right? So in other words, what happens when printing comes into is that that you have far more texts that float around, right? So before that, you have either the manuscript tradition or you have monumental kind of architectural calligraphy, right? But with the arrival of print, which really flourishes in the 19th and the 20th century, you have far more texts of all sorts, magazines, newspapers, etc., advertisements. So that also helps to desacralize, the script and to make it far more malleable, the way it's used in all of these different manifestations. So that's just as a kind of a background. So by the time the artists come to this, it's not just the grandiose, monumental scripts that they are looking at, but they're also informed by all of this history.
Let me just ask specifically, for instance, in the painting by Kada that you showed us, the green abstraction on an orange background, is there a particular style, or for that matter, a particular meaning that can be associated with the strokes in the upper part of the composition?
Well, so his is, that doesn't even look like Arabic. Okay. And, but he's also informed by Amazigh, kind of iconography, right? Which is, body signage, in North African kind of communities. So it's a kind of, he's bringing them together in this imaginative way, right?
Nada, thank you. Nada, let me turn to you and ask a sort of follow-up on Madiha Umar, who has played, it appears, such a catalytic role. And it's very hard to find examples of her work from the late 40s, from that moment of breakthrough. The picture that, as you said, is kind of the poster for the exhibition is from some years later. If you've seen some of that early work, how close is it to something more easily recognizable as calligraphy?
It's interesting that from the beginning, she really was not, even though, she speaks about discovering calligraphy, because like Iftikhar said, they have print, and particularly if we think of the first half of the 20th century as a moment of resistance, there's the sort of the change from the Ottoman to the Arab, and the idea of negotiating what does it even mean to be an Arab, and how to form a new country like Iraq, let's say. So they're really not looking at calligraphy in that sense. It's not even being taught at the Art Academy or the Art Institute, for example. So they are not really even privy to different examples of calligraphy. So when Madiha talks about discovering calligraphy while she is at the libraries in the US, in a way, it kind of almost literally means that it was not on her mind before that she actually saw this. So from the beginning, when she saw the calligraphy, it kind of allowed her to understand the possibilities of the plasticity of the Arabic letter. For the one thing that I was trying to sort of, bring across as I was presenting the work of those artists, that on some level, yes, the Arabic letter, they were looking for a way of making abstraction, of owning their own abstraction, because of the criticism that has been, around in the discussion that abstraction was a European, and it's sort of the part of the Cold War even struggle or rhetoric of abstraction. And so the Arabic letter kind of presented them with this example that it is so malleable, it is so plastic, they can form it and shape it in various ways that are unrelated to either the sacred text or even language specifically. So even in her earlier work, and there is a wealth of her work that her grandson is trying to sort of organize. She never got enough attention, and I think she deserves way more than she has received. So hopefully you'll be able to see more of her work. But from the beginning, she saw it in sort of the same way of that you're seeing these other, as part of a bigger pattern, as part of an arabesque.
Thank you. And a follow-up for both of you, really. In addition to, you've been speaking of artists, and this is a point you just made about Umar, people who saw themselves as artists and then in effect discovered calligraphy. But of course there were calligraphers. I mean, calligraphy didn't vanish. I mean, Iftikhar, this is picking up on the point you made a few minutes ago. Say in Iran, there was, I think it's the Nakashikat school of calligraphy. There are artists like Mohammad Esai working from the 60s to the present. I mean, there's really remarkable calligraphy that looks to us like, at least to me, like art. How do those, you know, calligraphers whom we might see as artists relate to artists who are engaged with calligraphy?
So one of the things that I think this is where issues of subjectivity, I think, become central, right? So in other words, partly the way, partly the way we think of art is the way we think of art in a kind of as framed in the post-Renaissance, you know, context in which artists are there's a kind of a subject. It's a subjective expression as much as it is perhaps a depiction of the world, right? And the way during the age of colonialism and so on, the way the arts of most of the non-Western world were not really seen as, you know, fully realized art, but they were seen as either decorative arts or they were seen as crafts, which didn't really have a subject, which didn't really have subjectivity. So part of the struggle for, you know, modernists is also to make that claim, right? So in other words, part of the kind of the formal strategies that that the modernists use is also to not really rely on. In other words, they need to get away from simply writing beautiful text in a traditional fashion, because that's, you know, where do you find the artist subject in that? I think that would be the question. But I think you can move towards it from both ends, right? You can move towards it from a kind of a metropolitan abstract, you know, but you can also move towards it from a kind of a practice that is based and emerges out of people who are traditionally trained. Okay,
Right.
it's the case though that in art schools, stuff was not being taught for the most part, okay, in the 20th century.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have a bunch more questions I prepared for the two of you, but I can see the number of questions from our audience adding up. So I think I should mute myself, or at least switch to my role as the spokesperson for the audience and ask you, pose some of the questions that they have posed. Let me start with one that, in fact, the three of us were discussing earlier, which is the difference between hurufiyya and calligraphic abstraction. I mean, are these synonyms, or do they address different kinds of art or different ways of looking at the art?
So do you want me
Well,
to?
Nada, why don't you start? I think you and I were talking about this before.
Sure, and I also wanted to actually add something to the last question that, you know, let's say, for example, in Iraq, calligraphy was not being taught at the Art Institute, or even there's a traditional craft sort of, you know, institute that was kind of on the down, and artists specifically differentiated themselves excuse me, from calligraphers. Again, it's that subjectivity aspect that Iftikhar was talking about. But so, I mean, to me, I shy away from the term calligraphic or calligraphy specifically to differentiate between the modern subjective aspect of engaging the Arabic letter, and also to differentiate between the other experiments that happened in different places, like Iftikhar was alluding to, you know, whether in Iran or on Pakistan or anywhere else where the Arabic letter is used. And that one sort of quotation from Jamil Hamoudi, where he specifically talks about how different it is for the Arabic and non-Arabic speakers to engage with the Arabic letter, you know, is one way of looking at what the Arabic letter means on different levels than just its connection to the Islamic civilization for the Arab masses, particularly as they are forming this sort of, you know, post-colonial consciousness, the Arabism as part of that notion of Arabism. So then it takes on a whole different significance to the Arab artist.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let me then move to another question. Iftikhar, please.
The question of terminology is always an important one, you know, as somebody who's coming to it from a kind of a post-colonial, you know, conceptual angle. I think, you know, what we are stuck with kind of terminologies that are never quite adequate to what we are trying to describe, you know. So I think I mean, calligraphic abstraction is one term which does certain kind of work and doesn't do others, right? Hurufiyya is also, I think, in some ways will have a slightly different purchase, perhaps, right? Even Hurufiyya, I think I would say that Hurufiyya was actually the name of a Sufi movement in which it was sort of an esoteric Sufi movement that thought about both the Arabic and the Persian alphabet, you know, in almost like Kabbalistic kind of terms, right? So I think even though even though artists may be secular, but then if you use the term Hurufiyya, is it not haunted by that kind of sacral past? Do you see what I'm saying? So,
yes.
So there are, we are, and maybe that's a good thing for all of these terms to be haunted by genealogies and legacies, because they help us to move and think about them in more capacious ways, I think. Okay.
Yes.
Historical ways as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we have a question. Well, actually, we have a very specific question, which I don't want to lose track of, which was, I think this was in reference, Iftikhar, to the El Salahi, where you mentioned that he added a little inscription at upper left. Does that say something? Can you read it? Does it have a particular meaning?
No, in that one, they always appear. You mean the?
I think it was perhaps in the last sound. I'm not entirely sure.
In the last sound, it's barely legible. It's really not meant to be. It's meant to act like a palimpsest. It's not really readable, you know.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Claire Davies, our friend who's a curator, who asks, how would the two of you square the formalist, well, square makes it sound like Kufic script. Okay, how would you square the formalist elements of calligraphy and the oral, not spoken, but A-U-R-A-L, heard nature of language that is invoked in the use of specific letters or reference to Quranic phrases? Are these paintings meant in some sense to be heard as well as seen?
I mean, the origin of abstraction, if you will, in the Western, you have people like Kandinsky who are very interested in music, right? Okay. So there is also there is a kind of an early 20th century notion of synesthesia, right? That is, that attends to the birth of abstraction, which has to do with, again, evoking a subjectivity and the senses and the imagination that moves one towards utopia, right? So certainly these are things that artists different. I think there's no one answer to this, but I think in the last sound, it certainly, you may read that painting in that way, right? In terms of its, as a kind of a compositional schema that also has oral, A-U-R-A-L associations. But, I think I would not generalize that to all the work that we talked about in this way. So.
Nada, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree with Iftikhar. And I would say, for example, we look at Madiha Omar's work, you actually can hear it. It has that sort of aspect to it, despite the fact that it's not even full text, as opposed to Jamil Hamoudi, which is a text that one can recognize as and understand the meaning of it, but it does not really want to be read or heard. It's rather very sort of formal and fixed. So like Iftikhar said, there's no generalized sort of, answer, but to my knowledge, Claire, I don't think any of these works were meant to be read. I mean, they were not made with the intention for them to be read, at least not, the works that I showed.
Okay, thank you. Let me transmit a question from Alex Segerman, who recalls that in the last session, Suhaila mentioned that the Euro-American term abstraction doesn't always apply in an Arab context. And Alex wants to know, did these artists use the word abstract or tajridi to explain their work? Does the English term do a good job of explaining what the artists were aiming for?
So, I mean, the issue of translation is a very complicated thing, and I'm sure we can all agree that words in their particular language carry at least a little bit of different signification when they're invoked. But to be honest, tajreed only means abstraction. So for the Arab artist, working with the notions of abstractions that are very varied under the term abstract in English, are the same. And I don't think, tajreed carries any specific meaning that we can't get across in abstraction. Maybe I'm a modernist, but I am the type of person who does not necessarily think that I need to, include the Arabic word between parentheses to express something specific, and feel that the English translation does express it. And sometimes it feels like it's a point of authentication that is not necessarily needed. So I would say that abstraction carries what tajreed wants to say.
Thank you. Iftikhar, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so in Pakistan, the same word is used, tajreed, but it means, actually, it doesn't mean, it means abstraction, but something else also. But it means something like an experimental approach, okay? So it could encompass abstraction, but it could also move into other kinds of modes, right? So there is a kind of there's a kind of a productive uncertainty to the meaning, the way it's used in Urdu.
And abstraction doesn't have that?
Well, it could be work that is, that could be an installation or something. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't have to be a easel painting.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Good point. Hey, thank you. A question here from Jane Debevoise, who asks, how were these works made visible and circulating at the time? Were there magazines and an art discourse that crossed or connected Arab countries, or indeed Arab countries in Pakistan? Were there galleries that published catalogs? Were there museum exhibitions with catalogs? And if I can tag a little caboose onto Jane's question, Iftikhar, I was struck by the resemblance between the Hamid Khatta and Shakar Ali's The Dark Moon of 1965, the great Pakistani artist. So that would be an interesting case in point for her more general question.
I think the question of how they get to know each other's work is an important one, because what's happening is, so some of them get to know each other in the diaspora, is what I mentioned. For example, both Al-Salahi and Anwar Jalal Shamsa overlapped at the Slate and got to know each other at that time in the later 50s, right? Some of them would show in the same galleries in Paris, for example, or in London. And there would be, sometimes there would be, so there's a kind of a sensibility or a structure of feeling at the time, but there's also actual contacts. But it's not the case that this is a well-defined movement with a manifesto. It's not, these are decentered projects. Some of them connect to each other in various ways.
Nada, I'm wondering if the situation may have been different in Iraq. I recall from conversations with Annika Lenson that there seem to have been journals as well as artist groups and so forth.
So, I mean, again, the different times, like, you just asked, where is Mediha Omar's work, when we haven't seen much of it. So, she was not necessarily a very active part of that circle because she was in the US for a while. But there was a group who, there were a lot of exhibitions starting from the 60s, but there were groups of artists and they kind of exhibited with each other. But then the 1970s, with the Arab sort of Association of Arab Plastic Artists and meetings in Baghdad and Syria and the Arab Biennale, that allowed for interaction among the Arab artists. I mean, I remember Brahim Salahi, for example, told me one thing he used to do is go to the Iraqi embassy in Sudan, where he will get art magazines and would know what others are doing to some extent. But so they were limited, not, a sort of a very wide circle, but it got sort of stronger in the 70s as they started also exhibiting in Beirut. So galleries in Beirut were hosting, more of that. In the 80s, diaspora initiatives in Europe, and even crossing over to the US, there was a gallery in DC, the Elf Gallery, for example, that used to exhibit a lot of those artists. So there are, there's sort of, different separate moments, but it's also very important to stress here again, like Iftikhar said, this was never a movement. It became a trend by some. By the 1980s, actually, its strength for Iraqi artists, particularly as the Azawi, argues, kind of ended. Its job ended. The Arabic letter was not needed in that way anymore, and because then it became a lot of other things that for those artists it was no longer useful.
Great, thank you. So now I have a question from someone whose name I don't recognize, but it's, I think, an important one, a little bit tendentious. So I'm going, and also it's a long question, so I'm going to try to summarize it, pointing out the role of individual collectors in shaping our understanding of art. And I'll draw a comparison here to say Jean Pigozzi and his collection of African art. For many, many years, pretty much every time we went to see an exhibition of African art, it was actually a selection from the Pigozzi collection. I think, we are now looking in this exhibition at a, wonderful selection of works from the Barjeel collection. There are a few other, extraordinary collections, which Suleiman spoke about last week, or recently himself as models for Barjeel. But what the question asked was, does the push to now I'm quoting, does the push to decolonize art history and the important aspects of this movement elide the privileges above and perhaps act as a guise to conceal the politics of representation? Is there a space for institutional critique to take place? So if we can ever so gently bite the hand that feeds us, how does it affect our understanding of this work that we see it as these collections as they're shaped by particular people in typically a situation of some privilege?
I mean, the conditions are such, in many countries in the global south that the state is no longer capable of, kind of in a sense, making responsible collections, taking care of them, doing scholarship on them. So I think that, to the degree that individuals and private, initiatives are doing this, I mean, I all power to them, I would say. Okay, I think this is a great service they're doing.
I would agree with Iftikhar on the all power to them, but this is actually a discussion I've had with Sultan himself, about the fact that, we do see Barjeel collection as the face of Arab art at the moment. And so what does that say of how we look at Arab art? And a collection, I mean, even working with the collection at Mathaf, which was initially the collection of Sheikh Hassan, as well a personal collection that then wanted to become a museum, although, different perspectives or different reasons for forming these collections and how they would develop, the fact remains that they are a collection. But I mean, we don't have that many options in the, in the Arab world or around the world for Arab art collections specifically, let alone the means of actually, viewing them. So we have to understand, and, yes, gently biting the hand is a good thing, that, this is a particular perspective, and it can only allow for certain, arguments to be forwarded. But, again, like Iftikhar said, our options are limited, and we're grateful that we have this.
And even the national collections are national, right? This is actually a pan-Arab collection.
Yes.
So I think that's important. It's for Sheikh Hassan's, So
yes.
it's important to underscore that.
Yes.
Right? You can see the kind of, connections and simultaneous kind of projects in collections like this, rather than a national collection. And national collection in North Africa, in a North African country, wouldn't necessarily know what's happening in Iraq, for example, right? So.
Okay, we are nearing the end. So I have two more questions from two different people, Ryan Mikati and Julian Sanchez Gonzalez. who address a related topic, so I'm going to try to squish them together into one long question. The first pointed out that Thea Al-Azawi's poetry book, which Nada you showed near the end of your presentation, is reminiscent of Itel Adnan's books that are simultaneously artworks, often a kind of accordion format, but also sometimes poetry. Is this related? Sorry about the noise from outside. Is this related to something specific in the Arabic tradition? And a second question from Sanchez Gonzalez asked, what about El-Azawi's use of the notebook in relation, for instance, to El Salahi's prison notebook, which was or is on view at the Museum of Modern Art right now? So can we delve at least briefly into the question of notebooks and paper as a medium for abstract art rather than canvas?
So for Azawi specifically, I mean, again, I think generalization is always dangerous, and try to sort of make a movement out of not necessarily something that is there. But poetry has always been an important part of the Arab culture, and particularly in the modern age, and with the sort of post-colonial and resistance sort of movements. And so there, for Azawi particularly, the work of Mudaffar al-Nawab, artist Mudaffar al-Nawab, who is one of the main poets who kind of revolutionized poetry in Iraq, but also, he's a communist known for his a very sort of critical and poignant poetry, was something that attracted Azawi when he was young from the beginning. And so he always found this affinity between his work and the words of the poet, someone like Mudaffar al-Nawab, and this is why he ended up with this sort of notion of these dafatar. But I mean, actually, if we want to talk then about a connection to an Islamic heritage, we can look at these dafatars as in terms of manuscripts and the sort of fullness, the completeness of a manuscript from the beginning of an end, seen as an object, as a sculpture, as opposed to a notebook to be read and to be seen that way. And this is how I would say that Ibrahim Salahi's notebook, his notes from the time when he was in jail, as opposed to Azawi's these objects of sort of visual poetry, as opposed to legible words, are very different in their nature. And I'm sure Iftikhar has something to add.
Just very briefly, thanks. I mean, I agree, Nada, and I'll just make another point, which is to say that one way to understand these mid to later 20th century, artists is also to see their connection to writing and to the literary world, right? Because they were all very, very deeply friends associated with the literary. Well, that's true of Ibrahim, that's true of the Al-Zawi, that's true of Persian artists, as well as artists in Pakistan, from that generation. So, so that may have something also to do with the question of writing and their interest in, the letter. Okay.
Thank you. Well, Lucy is reminding me that we are now out of time or over time. So I think what we need to do is schedule another panel to talk about art and poetry in the Arab world, which would be absolutely fascinating, but not tonight, alas. There were many questions that popped into the box that looked really interesting. I'm sorry it wasn't possible to get to all of them. I want to thank Iftikhar and Nada and Lucy and Eric for speaking and organizing, and everyone who tuned in, so to speak, tonight for being a participant and for posing so many interesting questions. And Lucy, do you have a closing word for us, or are we just going to stop here?
Pepe, I think a panel on poetry and abstraction in visual art is a great idea, and I'll keep it in mind for the future. Iftikhar, Nada, Pepe, many thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. And thanks to everyone in the audience for tuning in and for all your questions. I invite you to return for session 3, our final program in the webinar, which will take place 2 weeks from today on Thursday, June 18th at 6 o'clock, and which will address modern art in Algeria and Egypt. You'll find details on the screen here. and also on the Gray's website, where you can register, and you can also register from any link. Finally, a reminder that the entire 3-part webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Gray Art Gallery's website with closed captions in the future. This is Lucy Oakley signing off. Stay safe and be well.